Welcome to Civics and Coffee. My name is Alicia, and I am a self-professed history nerd. Each week, I'm going to chat about a topic on U.S. history and give you both the highlights and occasionally break down some of the complexities in history and share stories you may not remember learning in high school, all in the time it takes to enjoy a cup of coffee. Hey peeps, welcome back. So far in the Jackson series, I've provided an overview of his life and political battles and covered in depth the one major legislative initiative passed during his presidency, the Indian Removal Act. As I mentioned earlier this month, Andrew Jackson is one of our more complicated figures in history, and I knew I wanted to dive a bit deeper into his life and legacy. Luckily, the history community is not short on brilliant minds, and so I reached out to Jerry over at the Presidencies of the United States podcast. If you've listened to this show for a while, then you know how much of a super fan I am of his thorough analysis of presidential administrations. Jerry is one of the most knowledgeable and astute individuals I know, and was one of the first members of this community to welcome me, and has been a constant champion, mentor, and all-around wonderful human being. I cannot say enough about his podcast, and I truly, truly hope you take a listen once you're done here. With that said, I hope you enjoy our conversation about Andrew Jackson. Our interview was recorded on Zoom, so I'm inserting my normal warning and apologies for any dip in audio quality. Enjoy, my friends. Hey peeps, welcome. With me today is one of my all-time favorite podcasters, Jerry Landry. He is the host of the amazing, detailed, and wonderfully crafted show, The Presidencies of the United States. And he does such a fantastic job bringing out the humanity of some of history's greatest political men. Welcome, Jerry.
Alicia, thank you so much. And thank you for that warm welcome. And likewise, I always like to start my day with a cup of coffee and civics and coffee. So cheers to that.
Cheers indeed, sir. We both are enjoying our coffees this morning. And so before we dive into our topic today, share with my listeners a bit about your show and what it inspired you to go into your deep, deep, deep presidential dives.
Absolutely. So presidential history has been something that as long as I can remember, I've been interested in. And I actually went through a project of going through president by president, a full biography of each of them. And as I was getting towards the end of that, it was like, okay, well, what's next? What am I doing? And my husband actually suggested, he's like, well, have you thought about doing a podcast? And I hadn't really. He's like, you've got all this knowledge, share it with folks. And here we are years later, and the presidencies of the United States is still going strong. We just began the Madison series. And after 5 years, yes, I am just up to Madison. We are finally getting done with 1809. If that gives any indication of how much of a deep dive this is. But with me, it really is about, we hear so much about the individual who is the chief executive. Mm-hmm. We don't always hear about the people and the events that also help to shape the story of the presidency. Mm-hmm. We don't hear about the folks who, were friends, were allies, were supporters, and also enemies. We don't hear about, we hear about some of the events, but there's so much that goes into, because it's a very complex story. It's a human story. Just like with all of us, we have so many things that impact our lives. And likewise with the presidency, there's so much that impacts it. And so that's really my aim, to highlight these lesser known individuals and stories and weave them back into the narrative so that we have a richer and fuller understanding of the presidency, what helped a presidency to succeed or not.
And you do such a wonderful job. I know every time I am thinking about kind of where am I going to go with any of my topics, I always use you as inspiration, because I feel like you, even though you do these deep dives, you provide such a breadth of context and you really ground the stories. And one of the things that got me into history to begin with was a history teacher who very much made the founding fathers real. And, he did it in kind of a caustic, sarcastic way, but I think you do it the same way by bringing in those other stories and crafting just an amazing narrative. So everybody should go check out the Presidencies of the United States. It, like I said, I have talked about it on the show before. It is one of my all-time favorites. So I'm so happy to have you here.
And likewise, I'm just so thankful to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. I look forward to our conversation. I always look forward to our conversations. I've had you on the special series. There's an episode that's coming out in July that you will be on as well. So
Yes.
everybody be on the lookout for that. We had a great conversation.
Yes, we did.
And it was a lengthy conversation, but
but it was so much fun.
Exactly.
Okay. So while we could spend a whole episode on all of our different nerddoms and conversations, I wanted to have you on today to discuss a president who has one of the most complicated legacies in American history, Andrew Jackson. And I think we could probably spend a lot of time just on his youth, but I really wanted to chat with you regarding his political career. Jackson's life story is pretty epic, and given his roots, it's kind of amazing that he made it to the White House. So, what do you think about Jackson, and what made him such a political powerhouse?
Well, and that's the thing, Alicia, you really get to a point that his story is so epic, and so many folks view him as being this larger than life figure, this bombastic, wild person. And yes, that is a part of his story. However, I think what isn't talked about as much with Jackson is that he was a skilled political operator, and he used this image. And I think that there was part of that, and especially when he was younger, he developed a reputation, and then he realized that he had a reputation, and he used it to a maximum benefit. And we see this in modern politics. We didn't see that quite as much. There were some folks that were well known or had a certain reputation, and yes, they did use that, but Jackson just seemed to use it in a way that is more like we think of politics today, really being a figure, a political figure, a rallying point for folks. At the time that he was coming up in the early republic, it was folks were rallying around individuals, but it was more about ideas. It was more about, this is our platform. This is what we think. With Jackson, they really rallied around him. Now, he did have a solid political view, and that's important in understanding him. However, I think it was more about him than it was some of the other figures in the early republic.
Right. Yeah, and I think for me, what I noticed is I knew he had a temper. Right, he was very quick to defend his honor, and so one of the things that I found fascinating that I think we'll dive into a little bit deeper in later in the episode is, when he's doing these arguments against some of these policies that he's known for, he didn't fly off the handle. He didn't have this overly emotional response, right? Both with the nullification crisis and with the bank wars. He was very purposeful and thoughtful in explaining to the people and to Congress, why he was against doing this. And given his background and given kind of, again, his reputation heading into the White House, it was kind of, surprising to see that was how he decided to react. So yeah, I agree with you. I think he was a very skilled political operative, which I always kind of find ironic considering, he's kind of an outsider, right? He was our original outsider. And so let's talk about the election of 1824. Jackson was a supremely popular candidate, winning both the popular and the electoral votes, yet he still lost the presidency. Can you share a little bit about this election and how it influenced Jackson once he won 4 years later?
Well, and that's the thing, the elections in the early republic aren't always the most exciting. Up until that point, most of the time you pretty much knew who was going to win. There
Mhm.
was a little back and forth here and there, but by and large, you the only one that really stands out is the election of 1800, and that's a whole other story. But by the time you get to 1824, at this point, the Federalists had pretty much died out. The party had faded away, and it really was the Democratic Republican Party, the party of Jefferson, the Jefferson banner. However, we know that people are people. And even if you say, oh, well, we're all one, you've got people who have differing views. You have people who take this idea and take it in different directions. They see different things, even if they say, oh, well, we're all the same. This is our platform. Also, you had very ambitious people coming up. You had people like Henry Clay. You had people like John C. Calhoun. You had people like Daniel Webster that were coming up and wanting to be a part of this. You also have John Quincy Adams. And John Quincy Adams, who you talked about recently on your podcast, he was more of this old school of,
Mhm.
well, I don't really want to be president, but if I happen to end up as president, I guess that wouldn't be the worst thing in the world.
Exactly.
And John Quincy Adams at that point was the Secretary of State under James Monroe, and that was seen as kind of being a stepping stone to the presidency. So naturally, he was in the mix. I mentioned Henry Clay. Henry Clay was the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and Henry Clay had already transformed that office into more of what we think of the Speaker position nowadays. It was
Mhm.
really, he was the first one to really wield the power of the speakership. He was ambitious. He wanted to be president as well. And he wasn't quite as quiet and aloof as Adams was, but still kind of along those lines. Here's my resume. I'd really like to do something else besides be speaker. I'm not going to tell you what that is, but just make some things happen.
Yep.
You also have William Crawford, who at that point, again, a member of, and that was the thing about the Monroe cabinet. He had these folks. He had Calhoun as his Secretary of War. He had Crawford as the Secretary of the Treasury, and these folks were ambitious. Crawford was from Georgia. He was really seen as being more of that Jeffersonian Republican point of view. He was seen as being maybe a natural successor to Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. Calhoun, likewise, he was from South Carolina and ambitious, still young at that point, but he was seen as being somebody who could make things happen. He was really effective as Secretary of War. And so folks start thinking, well, maybe this young Calhoun is somebody to watch out for. And then you have Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson at this point was a military hero. This was after the Battle of New Orleans, which even though it was fought, the Treaty of Ghent had been agreed to, it hadn't been ratified yet. So the war was technically still on, but barely.
Mhm.
But they didn't know that. And so the Battle of New Orleans was a successful victory, one of the few on land in the War of 1812 for the American side. And so Jackson had become a nationwide celebrity.
Mhm.
He was also seen as, he had already had this reputation of being this bombastic, I'm just going to do it my way character. At this point, he had invaded Florida, I don't know how many times. He had two British subjects executed on Spanish soil and caused this international incident, and somehow walked away and everybody was still, oh well, Jackson,
Yep.
he's the best, maybe we need this guy, maybe we need an outsider, because we've had these people who are claiming to be Democratic Republicans, who are claiming to be these heirs to Jefferson, but it seems like things are getting more, the federal government seems to be getting more power, more authority. We've got this bank, this national bank that really seems to be causing problems. At this point, the Panic of 1819 had happened. It was the first nationwide depression in the early republic. And so folks were like, maybe we need a change. But meanwhile, the political insiders were looking at Jackson and saying, oh, heavens, no. This guy is, are you kidding me? This guy is what it would be madness. This guy, we cannot trust him. We don't know what he's going to do. And so you get to the election of 1824, and previously in previous elections, the voter suffrage had been restricted to a small group of folks. There were some exceptions, but by and large, it was white male landowners. And sometimes it was, they had to own a certain amount of land to be able to vote. Suffrage was starting to expand. And, we'll see this in American history in decades and centuries after, but this is the first big expansion of the right to vote. You're starting to get all white males, not just landowners. They don't have to have a certain amount of land or property or funds to be able to vote. So, Jackson, this was his key demographic, because they looked at him and saw this guy who was championing, the banks have too much power. They're taking all the wealth. The federal government is taking too much authority. He was really that outsider that they thought could come in, and we see this trope time and time again in American politics, that this guy is going to come in and clean up the swamp. He's going to, sweep everything out and get the government running like it really should to benefit the people. And so you have the election of 1824. And because you have all of these different candidates, you end up with Jackson winning, like you said, the popular vote and the electoral vote, but it's not, the electoral vote isn't at the threshold that is needed in order to secure the presidency. And so in that case, it goes to, you take the top three candidates and they go to the House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives then decides who is the president. Now, by this point, William Crawford, even though he won popular votes and electoral votes, Crawford had suffered a stroke. His health was poor. His supporters had tried to downplay it and keep it out of the news. There's this big, what we would call a cover up nowadays. No, he's fine. He's fine. No, you can't see him. Of course you can't see him. He's too busy right now. You just take our word for it. He's doing cartwheels in the back, I promise. But word leaked out and folks knew Crawford, that was just not going to happen. And so the top two candidates beyond Crawford were Jackson and John Quincy Adams. Now, I mentioned that Henry Clay was the Speaker of the House of Representatives. Henry Clay came in fourth, and thus he was not in the top three that was sent to the House. But as Speaker, and especially as Henry Clay, Speaker of the House of Representatives, he wielded a large amount of influence. And here is where, if you've heard, if our listeners have heard of the corrupt bargain, this is when this happens. So basically, and the thing is, Jackson would play this up, but Jackson's folks reached out to Clay as well. It wasn't just John Quincy Adams and his supporters. It was Jackson's supporters too, reaching out to Henry Clay. Hey, do you think that maybe we can work something out? That was really not in the cards for Jackson because Henry Clay was one of those political insiders that looked at Jackson and was like, this guy's a madman. There's no way I want him to be president.
Right.
So ended up the House voted for John Quincy Adams. He became the sixth president, even though he lost the popular vote and the electoral vote. And then Adams names Henry Clay as his Secretary of State, that position that is seen as the stepping stone to the presidency. And Jackson and his supporters cried foul. They were like, this is a corrupt bargain. They made a deal, make Adams president. Clay is going to become Secretary of State and be a shoe-in for the presidency on down the road. And therein starts the second party system. Mm-hmm. You have Jackson and his supporters breaking off from what was the Democratic Republican Party, and you have the insider party kind of rallying around Adams and Clay. And 4 years later, this party system is really more developed, and it's a different story than 1824.
Mm-hmm. And I think it starts this when once Andrew Jackson kind of comes into office in 1828, I think it kind of put a chip on his shoulder, right? He was like, I should have been here 4 years ago. And so I think that just made him less open to kind of any kind of compromises and dealings in legislation. And, and maybe also perhaps he was impacted by the fact that he had just lost his wife. But it just seemed like he wanted to rebel against the establishment as much as humanly possible, just to prove, this is why people chose me, and this is why people chose to put me into the office. And, you've highlighted a little bit but the election of 1824 kind of also saw the start of one of the most notorious political feuds in American history between Jackson and the former Speaker of the House, Henry Clay. And for those who might not study political history, can you share your thoughts on why these two powerhouses of government just never seem to get along?
Absolutely. And I think it really stems from Clay was more the insider. Mm-hmm. He was a Washington political operator. Jackson was this outsider. He was seen as being somebody who was going to clean up Washington. And the election of 1824 definitely did not help their relationship. Jackson was very bitter about that loss. And let's go ahead and say, justifiably. I mean, yeah. he really should have been the one that the House chose. And it was saying that it was really slapping the voting populace in the face, saying, we don't care that you really wanted this guy. Here's the person who's going to be president. And it kind of made Jackson's point that there is corruption going on, that Washington isn't working for the common people. Washington isn't working for the voting populace. Washington is working for their own agendas, their own devices. But you also have this fundamental ideological difference. Henry Clay, and this was before he really came up with his American system as it would come to be known, but he was already going in that direction. And we see this in Madison, we see this in Monroe, we see this in John Quincy Adams. That part of the party was really leaning towards a stronger federal structure, both in terms of government, in terms of the national bank, in terms of infrastructure. It was this idea that government can do certain things. No, it doesn't say in the Constitution that the federal government can build the national road. However, we need a national road, and isn't that necessary and proper? Get to that necessary and proper clause. So if we need it and the federal government is really the only one that can do it, let's use our authority. Let's use the funds that we've got available. if we need more funds, we've got the national bank can help us out. Let's go ahead and make things happen. Let's build a better nation. Let's use our authority versus Jackson, who saw this as, well, you know, it doesn't say in the Constitution that we can build a national bank or that we can build a national road. It doesn't say that we can have a national bank. What are we really doing here? And, isn't that, this is an agreement, this is a compact that we agreed to as citizens. And yeah, maybe we do need these things, but we can amend the Constitution if we so choose. If we really want to say that we've got this, that we want this authority. But really, is that the place of government? Is that something that government should be doing, or should private citizens get together, form a company? And you saw that at the time, for things like canals,
Hmm.
you would have these major landowners or these leaders in a community that would come together, form a company, and they would build a canal or they would build a road. Maybe we need to let that be more private industry, private citizens driving that, because who's to say the federal government knows where that road should go or which canal should be built? Why should the federal government say that we're going to choose this part of the nation to help support and to provide more infrastructure for versus another part of the nation? That gives them so much power and authority to be able to pick and choose winners and losers. Maybe they don't need to be in that business.
Hmm.
And so ideologically, they were different. But it really, as time went on, it became more personal. It was
Hmm.
all about this corrupt bargain. And, Clay stole the election from me, and we're coming back in 4 years and we're going to show them.
Yeah. For me, what I've always kind of thought of these two men is, Henry Clay was, I think, probably one of the most gifted political operatives of the early republic. I mean, so many compromises, so many, bringing the country off of the precipice was really at his hands. And he took the long game, right? He took the long view. He understood that in order for a republic to function, in order for a government of massive amounts of people to really work and be helpful, you had to make compromises. You had to do some dealings. You had to maybe swallow a little bit of the poison pill to get the bigger picture established. And I think, as you've mentioned, Jackson very much was against anything that seemed improper and just took these compromises and these agreements as these corrupt deals, right? He saw that while he was in the state legislature in Tennessee, right? He was like, no, this is corrupt. I'm not about this life. And so I always thought they just had very different viewpoints on what it meant to run a government successfully. And one of my favorite quotes actually is from Jackson when he said, upon retiring from the White House, that his regret was not shooting Henry Clay.
And
um,
if anybody would do it, it would be Jackson.
yeah, the man with a couple of duels under his belt. So I just, and I agree with you. I know he blamed Henry Clay a lot for Rachel Jackson's death, his wife. And so, yeah, I agree with you. I think it got really personal, but also just a fundamental difference in how they viewed the way to do government. And they just never, I can respect both of them, and I disagree with both of them for various reasons. And it just seems like those two just got so stuck in their corners that they couldn't see that, you both have really good ideas and really could really make a functioning government. So it's one of those what ifs in history, right?
Absolutely. And that's the thing. And we see it throughout American political history. You have some people, and you mentioned that Clay was a compromiser. He
Mhm.
was a practical politician. He realized, here are my viewpoints. I know I'm not going to get 100% of what I want right now, but if I make a compromise, if we get to an agreement, at least I can get some of the way,
Mhm.
and then we come back tomorrow and I can push again. versus Jackson, that was, it's my way or the highway. I'm not compromising. I don't have to compromise. I'm Andrew Jackson. And if you don't like it, meet me outside and we'll duel.
Yes, you're not wrong. And so you kind of touched on this as you were talking about the election of 1824, but really, one of the unintended consequences of the election was the establishment of the Democratic Party. And Jackson partnered, oddly enough, with Martin Van Buren to help build this united organization for future political success. So why do you think these two, of all the people that could have come together, why do you think these two seem to develop such an easy alliance?
Well, and that's the fascinating thing. So in the election of 1824, Van Buren was not supporting Andrew Jackson. He was one of those Crawford supporters who were saying, "Oh, everything's fine. He's just napping right now. It's fine. It's okay. Just go ahead and elect him president, and we'll work everything out from there." Part of the reason that Van Buren signed up with Crawford was because Crawford was seen as being somebody who was malleable. He was
Mhm.
somebody that you could help to shape. And Van Buren wanted to be that power behind the throne. He had already established himself in New York politics as this political machine maker. He was the little magician. He was able to make things happen without folks even realizing what was happening. He knew he was able to pull the right levers, press the right buttons, get things moving. He wanted somebody that he could take this show on the road to the national level, but he knew he needed the right person. And so when Crawford ended up 1824 was not going to happen, and didn't know if he was actually going to make it to 1828, Van Buren starts going around and shopping for a new candidate, and he sees this guy Jackson. There's a lot of buzz around him, and especially after the corrupt bargain and all of this, Jackson's getting more. They didn't have broadcasts in those days, but he was getting more airtime. He was getting
Mhm.
more of the press. He was getting more of the buzz. And so Van Buren, scratched his head, did a little think, and he's like, okay, I can make this work. And so he starts getting in with Jackson, and he becomes the organizer that Jackson needs, because Jackson had supporters, but Van Buren was on a level unlike anybody of the day. At this time, and we've talked about the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, and we call those parties. They weren't really what we think of as a
Mhm.
political party with an organization, with state branches, local branches, all of this, with conventions. It was really more of factions. It was
Mhm.
really more, okay, well, we kind of all agree on some basic tenets. We'll write to one another, see if we can get some buzz going. But there wasn't really that organization. That's where Van Buren came in. That's what Van Buren was able to give to Jackson. He was able to say, okay, well, we need people organized in New York and Pennsylvania. We need people organized in Virginia. We need people organized in these places, these key places. And we need to coordinate our message.
Right.
We need to make sure that we're saying the same thing. We need to make sure that we are all on the same page. And if anybody gets out of line, let's bring them back into line, or let's take them out, one or the other. He provided that organization. And so the Democratic Party that started to form around Jackson was really because of Van Buren. Van Buren was able to bring this together and keep that message and keep on that corrupt bargain message, and that Jackson was the outsider who was going to change Washington. And you see in 1828, that is the consistent message. They kept it going,
Mhm.
and it took them to the White House.
Yeah, and I was always fascinated by the partnership, and maybe I put more emphasis on it than it deserves, but I always found it fascinating that Andrew Jackson, the Southerner, the frontiersman, the man of the people of and of the West, built this relationship with the Yankee, right, from New York. And I'm always kind of curious, do you think that helped galvanize that Democratic Party? Because as you were saying, there was factions. It was a lot of regional identities, right? If you were from the South, you tended to be one way. If you were in the North, you tended to be a part of the Federalist faction. And so I'm just curious, do you think that really helped, that coalition of regions help really galvanize what became the Jacksonian Democratic Party?
Absolutely. And I think that's part of what made this partnership. I think 1824, that election really set the stage for this new phase of political parties because, just as Van Buren was shopping for a candidate, Jackson realized he had tried to play the game
Mhm.
like it was done in the time and it hadn't worked. He had been defeated. And even though he had succeeded, he had won the popular vote, he had won the electoral vote, he still lost. And he realized we can't play by the same games. And here's where you get Jackson as a political thinker. He
Mhm.
realized something needed to change. He needed to have another approach in 1828. He could not do the same thing that he did in 1824, or he may lose again. They may make another corrupt bargain. They'll figure out some way to keep him from the presidency unless he changes the rules. And he saw Martin Van Buren, once that connection started, he saw this guy's talking different than the other folks who have been helping me to organize, helping support me. This guy's something different.
Mhm.
And Van Buren realized, because even to the very beginning, one of the reasons why George Washington and some of the early founders, why they felt that political factions, political parties were bad, is that they thought that they would form in regions, that there would
Mhm.
be a party for the Northeast, that there would be a party for the South, there'd be a party for the Mid Atlantic, and it would tear the nation apart.
Mhm.
Van Buren looked at this and was able to convince Jackson. And that's the thing, like Jackson's popularity was nationwide.
Mhm.
He was somebody who everybody across the nation knew and supported. And you see it in the election results in 1824. You see that he has support in all regions of the nation. And that's part of what made him an attractive candidate to Van Buren, because Van Buren realized we can't just have a Northern party.
Right.
We need to be able to have supporters in the North. We need to have supporters in the South. We need supporters in the West. We need to bring all these folks together under one banner if we're going to win. And so both of them, because of what happened in 1824, came together and were able to build what was a national party. And it led to success in 1828. And there's a reason why this is called the Jacksonian era, because this completely reshaped politics. This completely reshaped what folks thought of in terms of presidential politics, as well as national politics, regional politics, state politics. And it lasts for decades. It finally breaks down when we get to the beginning of the Civil War, but it lasts. What Van Buren put in place and what Jackson was able to be the rallying figure for stays in place for decades.
Right. It's one of the impacts and the legacies of Jackson, right? Obviously he has his other not so great legacies, but always whenever you're reading about Andrew Jackson, you always kind of glean onto the fact that Jacksonian democracy, that Jacksonian political party, is one of the most lasting legacies of his presidencies and really changing the idea. And I think it definitely came into power in a time in history that it was kind of brewed for his success, right? As you had mentioned before, there's that expansion of suffrage, and there was more broadbands or broadsides, excuse me, that, he was able to get his message out, or his supporters were able to get his message out more clearly, more concisely, and they saw kind of more returns. So it's always something that I've always found pretty fascinating. And we've touched on this a lot throughout the our conversation thus far, but I think it's such an important piece of his identity that I do want to kind of maybe focus in on it a little bit more, just for during his presidency. We've talked about how Jackson is the first candidate to be painted as a political outsider, to lean into being a political outsider, to really just utilizing that as his message, and to get him into the office of the president. So I'm curious, how do you think that broad brush, that outsider label, impacted his presidency?
I think it was a huge impact on his presidency because you have somebody, and he proved in the lead up to 1828, he was willing to change the rules. He was
Mm-hmm.
willing to do something that he was willing to act in ways that political candidates and political parties hadn't to that point. And so he brought that to the presidency. Now, he had early stumbles, the petticoat affair and all
Mm-hmm.
that. It kept him from really pushing his agenda at the beginning. And so you almost get a sense that they were starting, the political insiders were starting to get lulled into, well, maybe Jackson isn't going to be that bad. And then you have the bank war. You have this radical rethink of where we're going as a nation. Let's go ahead and, I'm going to take this on. I'm going to take on, I'm not going to mince words. I'm not going to play with kid gloves. I'm just going to do what I think is right. And if anybody doesn't like it,
Too bad.
whatever, you know, whatever. Even if you're in my cabinet and you don't like it, I will just fire you and find somebody who will do what I want. And because he was this inside, or because he was this outsider, because he was something different, I think that empowered him and allowed him to do more and take more chances than we had seen previously with other
Mhm.
presidents. We had some presidents that went out on a limb a bit, but Jackson was all the way at the edge of the limb, and he was okay with that. He was
Right.
perfectly fine with that. And he knew that his supporters would back him because that's why they elected him in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I just, for me, I always kind of look at him as the outsider of, he didn't care to build consensus, right? He really took that label and, wore it like a badge of honor. And, he's like, I don't need to build any consensus. And I think it also really led him to say no a lot, right? Which is
Mhm.
why he only has the one legislative accomplishment in his 8 years of presidency, but he's got a lot of no's that he did. And so, yeah, I feel like that outsider cloak really just put him in a position where he felt like, I don't have to work with you. You're going to do what I want. And if you don't do what I want, well, I'm president and I'm going to go ahead and exercise my executive authority, which is always something I found ironic as well, right? Here he's kind of been an originalist. And I feel like this is a theme for most presidents who are like, it's not in the Constitution. And yet they go ahead and they exert the most amount of executive power. He reminds me a lot of Jefferson in that realm, right? It's not necessarily in the Constitution, but he's going to lean into his executive authority. And I feel like, that helped him in the moment, and it helped it with his legacy, right? Because now he's the man of the people, and he remained the man of the people for, decades afterwards. I just think in recent analysis of his life and presidency, he's getting a different a different interpretation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's the thing. You see him, like, even up into the 20th century, you see folks looking at Jackson for that as
Mm-hmm.
being this populist, this, no compromise, it's my way or the highway kind of candidate, and looking at that as a strength, as
Mm-hmm.
something that to aspire towards. And that legacy, we are starting to rethink what Jackson's legacy was, because there are these other pieces that really are important to include in that. And maybe we do need compromise sometimes. Maybe we don't just need to say no all the time.
Right.
And that makes us think and rethink the time, him, and where we're going.
Right. Yeah, and he just reminds me of he I think for me is one of the first presidents that he's the president of his people, not of all people. And unfortunately, I think this continues as a trend in American politics. It swings, right? We definitely have some
Mhm.
presidents who are more aware of the duty and the responsibility of that office. But I think one of the other things with him is being that outsider, knowing that there is a whole swath of individuals that didn't want him to be president. He didn't feel the need to prove them wrong, right? He just was going to say, well, forget you. I don't care about you then. I'm going to do what I think is right, instead of, taking that wider lens and saying, okay, what's in the best interest of the country? How do we heal the nation? How do we make sure that people understand, this was a good call. You'll be happy that you put me into this office. And I think that impacted his way of doing business as well.
Well, and part of that, I wonder, Alicia, if it's, and this is something that I've wondered, and I haven't gotten to him yet, but I know I'm going to have plenty of time to delve into the Jackson mindset. Heaven help me. But I've always wondered if maybe it stems from his military background,
Mm,
and in the military, being a general, being a leader,
mm,
you have to know the people under you are going to follow you. And if they get out of line, there are consequences there. You go ahead and enforce discipline. And so for him, I think he approached politics in kind of the same way. Okay, I know I've got the people behind me, and anybody who's not behind me is not the people, they are the enemy.
mm.
And I will take them out. We will take them out. I will lead you into victory. And that does become, it's dangerous because it
Mhm.
becomes divisive. You're either with us or against us. It's not that we are the American people. My people are the American people.
Right.
Henry Clay and your folks, I don't know who you are except the enemy, but
Right.
you're not American. I am the voice of the American people. I am the people's president.
That's actually a very astute analysis, and like now I can't wait for 5 more years until you get to him and listen to you explore his mindset. That does make a lot of sense, actually, and I hadn't thought about it. So thank you for bringing that perspective. I
No
appreciate it.
worries.
And then for someone who was seen as that quote unquote outsider, he really did, and you've touched on this already, he really did seem to have a knack for politics, right? He was a political thinker. He learned a lot of lessons in 1824, and really him and his supporters used that media of the time, broadsides and lithographs and so on and so forth, to really get his face out there, get his story out there. So, do you think of Jackson as one of our first media savvy presidents?
Absolutely. And that's the thing. We just it's a given nowadays that you've got to be media savvy if you're going to run for president, or
Mhm.
if you're going to be a national leader of any ilk, and even like state and local politics, you need to have some media savvy. It's a given. Back in those days, it wasn't,
Mhm.
because again, suffrage had been restricted to this white male landowner by and large. Again, a couple of exceptions from time to time, but by and large, white male landowners. These were the wealthy elites. And so it was seen then as, well, we converse amongst one another, we write letters, have correspondence, and we're able to share information. Hey, this guy's from your state, What do you know about them? Okay, if you're supporting them, I'll support them. But as suffrage is expanding, as we're getting all white men who are able to vote, you don't have that anymore. You
Mhm.
have some people who are illiterate. You have people who aren't connected and don't know somebody in New York or Massachusetts or Georgia or Tennessee to write to say, well, who's this guy who's running for president? You really rely on the press. You really rely on these broadsides, because even for folks who couldn't read, they would go to a common area, whether
Mhm.
that was church or a pub or whatever. Somebody would read out these broadsides. Somebody would read out these newspapers. You start to see folks delivering public speeches. They didn't have social media or TV or radio back in those days. They needed something to do. And so, yeah, okay, somebody's delivering a speech. Yeah, let's go. I don't care if it's 3 hours. What do I have to lose? And so you start to see this information being disseminated in new ways and different ways. And Jackson, and because of that partnership with Van Buren, Van Buren helps him to really craft this image and craft this message.
Mhm.
And he is really able to get that message out there in ways that other political candidates hadn't, and really hadn't had to
Right.
until this point. This is a key point. So many things are coming together to really make Jackson be able to be what we now think of as Jackson and the Jacksonian legacy.
Right. And, you were mentioning, not everybody knew how to read. And so I think that's also why that portraiture and the lithographs became so important, right? Because America has a history of wanting to have that strong man as their leader, as their commander in chief. And so I think even just that visual of, well, do you want the strong general who brought the country together at the Battle of New Orleans, or do you want some random political insider overthinker who has spent his entire life in Europe? Who is he? Is he even American? Right. I think just that visual media and how it was widely disseminated for the first time, and again, like you were saying, it's no longer the insiders or the politically juiced in that were making those decisions anymore. It was now an opportunity for the common man to utilize their voice, and very astutely, I think Jackson and Van Buren recognized that moment and they took advantage of it in ways that other candidates did not and hadn't even thought of. And again, I think that turns into its own legacy, its own influence in future elections, because now you start to see the political cartoons, you start to see those sleights of hand as you're trying to champion your candidate in future elections.
Well, and you see, prior to this, so let's look at the Jackson's predecessors. So by and large, they were not known for being military leaders,
Right.
except for George Washington.
Mhm.
And George Washington, even now, even in the present day, is still such a looming figure. But this was even closer to Washington. And he was the first national figure. We have celebrities nowadays, but he was the one that everybody knew. And so Jackson leaning into, well, this guy's the hero of the Battle of New Orleans. He
Right.
was that general. He was the best general since that other guy that George Washington. And he used that connection. And so you see after this, you see General William Henry Harrison,
Mhm.
General Zachary Taylor, General Winfield Scott. You see people leaning into this military background, and it becomes a trope for a time. And
Mhm.
we don't have that quite as much in the modern era, but this is when this really starts, leaning into this military history and success as proving that you are a leader. and
Right.
and Jackson, that was very astute. And again, like his partnership with Van Buren, I think they both realized this is something we need to lean into.
Right. And it worked for them for plenty of elections. And so Jackson, I think, is largely known outside of, history nerd world for his devastating policy against Native Americans. But he also battled some pretty key domestic issues with the nullification crisis and put really his political life on the line over the Battle of the Second Bank of the United States. And so I'm just curious, as somebody who has, really studied and done those deep dives into these types of administrations and these types of crises, in your estimation, which of those two domestic battles carried the biggest threat to his presidency?
So I would say the bank war, and in part because that was the design. So with the Second Bank of the United States, the First Bank of the United States had been allowed to expire. Its charter was not renewed. But then we went into the War of 1812. We needed a national bank in order to help the nation's finances, help the nation's economy move forward. And so they chartered the Second Bank. The charter was coming up, and it would come up in Jackson's second term. But as 1832 election year approaches, and Henry Clay once again wants to try for the presidency. And at this point, he had started building his own political party, his own political structure. And he realized this is something, if I can get Jackson on the record as being against the bank, if I can get his supporters as being on the record as being against the bank, we can run as the pro-bank party. We can take this, we can talk about what the bank does in terms of fueling our economy, in terms of giving us an infrastructure that we need to avoid any fiscal and financial calamities and economic calamities. The bank really helps. And so he pushed for an early renewal of the charter. And this is when you get Jackson's veto of the bank bill. Henry Clay's able to move it through, but when it gets to Jackson, this is one of those times that Jackson says, no, I'm going to veto this. And then that becomes the issue of 1832. And Clay thought this would destroy Jackson. Right. He was convinced, and that's why he pushed for this being the issue. Now, unfortunately for Henry Clay, he misread the American people. He did not realize they really don't think too highly of the bank. Mm-hmm. They see the bank like Jackson sees the bank, as wielding this undue influence of, really constricting and controlling the finances of the nation. And they see the bank as being the creditor, that this is the bank that's coming after you. Well, you haven't paid you haven't paid on this loan. We're going to take your house. Debt was a major issue at the time. It still is in the present day, but it really could destroy folks. And the bank was the one that was coming after you. It was right. The enemy.
Right.
Again, we get to that, the enemy. And Jackson portrays himself as, I'm going to defeat this enemy for you. We're not going to let this bank and these bankers and these elites tell us how we're going to live. We're not going to let them control our economy. And Jackson wins in 1832, in part because of this.
Yeah. So I go back and forth in terms of which ones I think had the most threat to his presidency, because I agree with you. I think obviously Clay, the intelligent political operative that he is, crafted a panic, right? And he was very good at that. But like you were saying, totally misread the room and didn't realize that Jackson was elected in part because he didn't he didn't want to be a part of this insider class, this property class, even though, he did have his own property. And so I always kind of waffle between, was it the nullification crisis or was it the bank wars? And for me, why I always am thinking about the nullification crisis is, that came from the South, that came from this idea of these elites in the North are trying to undercut our ability to make a living. They're trying to impact our bottom line. And, Jackson being a Southern frontiersman president, I just felt like he had a lot on the line potentially there to come out against nullification and to say, this federal union, it has to be preserved. As I go back and forth. So,
Well, and part of the reason why and that's the thing, like the nullification crisis, and you get back to this idea from Jefferson, the fire bell in the night. And it really is speaking to, there is a problem here. There's a fundamental problem in the nation when you've got John C. Calhoun and the nullifiers saying, well, if we don't like something that the federal government does, we can just say we're not going to follow it because, we crafted the Constitution, the states ratified the Constitution. And so the states have the ultimate authority. The states can say, we just don't like this, and it's not going to be the law of the land in our land. And it's a fundamental problem. In terms of Jackson and why I would say that the bank crisis was probably the greater threat, if it had been anybody but Jackson as president at the time, if it would have been, James Buchanan in 1860, when the same kind of thing comes up again, we see that was a problem, that was a threat, and that his presidency was already pretty much destroyed at that point, but it completely wrecked his reputation versus Andrew Jackson. And because he is Andrew Jackson and he is this figure that is well known and well renowned and well respected across the nation, and by the way, he's also a Southern slave owner. He enslaves individuals just like John C. Calhoun, just like the folks in South Carolina. I think that in part keeps it contained to South Carolina at the time. You don't see other states starting to, oh, wow, maybe they do have a good idea as much. You've got folks here and there who are like, oh, well, Calhoun, he maybe he's on something, but they're not ready to go against Jackson.
Okay. That's a good argument. Today, you've got me on to the bank wars. The bank wars were the biggest. Talk to me tomorrow. I might change.
We'll see what tomorrow brings.
So returning to the bank wars a little bit, you mentioned that he went ahead, he put his political life on the line. He vetoed the bank charter in the run up to the election. He's reelected. And so given that he had already kind of done the damage, why do you think Jackson took the extra step of removing all the federal deposits?
So this gets to, he vetoed the renewal of the charter, but the bank was still operating under its charter and would operate. I think it was supposed to run out in
1836,
I believe it was.
Yeah.
So it was still operating, and Nicholas Biddle, the president of the bank, is already plotting, well, either, can we get another renewal in place, or how do we shift the bank? How do we shift operations to keep the bank going? And they ultimately do for a bit. It ultimately fizzles out. But part of that at that time, the federal deposits. So this was the money that was coming in to the federal government from tariffs, from revenue streams into the government. It was still being deposited and held in the bank. And just like with any bank, basically they've got this capital that they're able to use and then make loans and do the banking business, being able to use these funds whenever it comes time that somebody wants to withdraw the money. They have to have it on hand But while it's just sitting there, they're going to make use of it. Jackson realized that. And he realized that there was this large amount of funds sitting in the bank that they were using, and Nicholas Biddle was going to use it either to get a renewal of the bank, because of course this was the corrupt bank, this was the corrupt Biddle, this was the corrupt enemy. They were going to find some way to finagle and bribe folks and do whatever they needed to in order to keep the bank going, unless he withdrew that money and it was no longer theirs to use. And so that's why he goes ahead and withdraws the federal deposits from the bank. He also, in this, it wasn't just, let's withdraw the funds, let's put it into some smaller banks, into state banks, because even though, yes, we can't just, he can't just put it into the East Room and have this pile of cash just laying there, all this gold bullion. We can't have that. We need it to be somewhere secure until we figure out what we're going to do with it. Let's put it into these state banks. They're secure. They'll be able to hold it, but we don't put it into just one bank.
Right.
And again, this gets back to Jackson. He doesn't want to, he says he doesn't want to play the game of picking winners and losers. He is going to pick certain state banks to invest in, and this will help them in those localities to be able to have a little more influence and to be able to fund more economic ventures and things like that. But he's not going to put it into one bank, because he doesn't want one bank to have all that authority. These funds, this is power that he's granting to these state banks, but he's granting a little bit to a lot of different institutions. And so that's why he does that. He realizes this power that these funds have and can have, and he wants to disperse it. He doesn't want a challenge to him, to his authority, in the form of these federal deposits.
Yeah, and you mentioned it earlier in our conversation about how, if people didn't agree with him, even in his own cabinet, he was going to fire them. And this was one of those situations where his Treasury Secretary was like, "You don't have the authority to do this, sir. You should not be doing this. Do not collect go. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200."
But let me pull out the Constitution, and can you point to where in the Constitution you can withdraw the federal deposits from the Bank of the United States? You can't. Okay, we don't really need to do that.
Right. And so I always kind of giggle whenever I read that story. I'm like, oh, the original Midnight Massacre. Here we go.
Because, he fires that Secretary of the Treasury because he wasn't going to withdraw the funds, and he pulls in Roger Taney, who is his trusted, right-hand person. He's this, he is this hatchet man for Jackson. And he's like, "Taney, I want this to happen. Do you have a problem with this?" "No, sir, I don't have a problem with it at all. I will be more than glad." And then when John Marshall ends up passing away, Taney gets his reward and becomes the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Talk about corrupt bargains. Whatever. It's Jackson doing it, so it's okay. If
it's
Henry
different.
Clay, it's different.
And also, can we just laugh at the fact that the man was against the second bank of the United States, yet his face is on the $20 bill?
Exactly. I do wonder what he would think of that.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure he's probably spinning in his grave. Like, are you kidding me, people? Of all the things to put my face on, paper currency, no.
You really don't get it, do you?
Oh, so good. Okay, so as we wrap up our chat today, I'm curious. We've touched on it a little bit, but what do you think, and what would you say is Jackson's lasting legacy?
Well, I think, we've touched on a couple of things that I think really speak to his impact. First of all, this new idea of what political parties can be, a more organized structure, a national structure. And, that reshapes everything. The entire history of presidential politics and national politics moving forward is based more on this Jacksonian ideal than this loose faction system that had previously existed. Also, this idea of rallying around one person. You see some of
Mhm.
this with Washington, you see some of this with Jefferson, but it just seems like Jackson takes it to this whole new level, and it becomes about the ideas, but it's Jackson's ideas. Jackson is at the heart of it. And you see that, you know, for decades and even, arguably a century later, this idea of Jacksonian principles
Mhm.
just lives on. And this idea of the outsider, this idea that we need somebody who's not a political insider who can come in and take a fresh look at things and maybe shake things up a bit. This becomes a trope. This becomes something that politicians, even up to the present day, turn to again and again and again, and the populace turns to again and again and again. We had a string of governors who became president in the later part of the 20th century, and going into the 21st century. They were the Washington outsiders who were going to come in and change things. This is still something that is very much alive in American politics to the present day. And Jackson is the one who really kicks this off. And his impact on American history, for better or worse, and there is room to talk about the bad impacts that he had, but for better or worse, he is this looming figure in American history and is so important. And that's one reason. So I'm in my presidential library, so to speak. All my presidential books are in this room, and I actually have a piece of original art. And I never imagined, if I was going to get a piece of original art, that it would be a portrait of Andrew Jackson. But this was a piece done by a native artist, Matthew Bearden.
Mm.
And basically, it was for a documentary about the Trail of Tears. And the
Mhm.
commission was make Jackson as unfavorable, make him as just vile as you can imagine. And so I'm actually looking at the portrait right now, and for me it's a reminder that we need to talk about these things. We need to talk about the whole picture of
Mhm.
his legacy. Yes, arguably there are good things that he did, there are also negative impacts, and this lives with us to the present day, and we have to remember that and talk about it and explore it in order to understand where we're at and to be able to plot a path forward for where we're going, and hopefully having a better impact and having future generations look back on us and say, you know, yeah, there were problems, but maybe they did something good. We have to acknowledge the harshness of the past and the bad legacies, the good legacies,
Mhm.
all of the legacy, in order to try and make our legacy, the one that we're leaving, hopefully be a more positive one.
Yeah, I think that was so well said, and a lot of it I agree with. And I just I wish that the American people might learn that it's maybe not always a good idea to have somebody who's from the outside who doesn't understand the functions of government. Um, I think Jackson, he had one legislative accomplishment, which was to devastate the thousands of indigenous Americans that lived within our borders. And so, yeah, I can appreciate the establishment of political parties, although I'm sure there are plenty of people out there today that wish that never happened, and that there was no organized political structure that ever came out of the election of 1824. But it is what it is, and he definitely has a looming presence. And I agree with you. I think this concept of outsider has stuck in our political discourse. I also think he really galvanized the idea and the concept of being of the people, and really being kind of that populist, like you mentioned. And for me, the other kind of side to it is, you got that political legacy, right? That political structure and impact. I also look to what our lands look like, and the fact that we decimated an entire population of First Americans, and what that means to them today. I had been doing some research for an episode about the Indian Removal Act that was just played last week by the time this goes live. And it's devastating that the generational wealth, right? That was one of the biggest kind of surprises for me, that I knew about it, but to see it in kind of raw figures, that's one of his legacies, right? Is he forever hobbled a whole swath of people that lived within this country, and that's, like you said, the good with the bad. So he definitely is a complicated man, which is another reason why I wanted to have somebody else on the show, because I know I can get lost in my own thoughts and processes. So I really appreciate you bringing the context and the analysis like you do to all of your other shows. So thank you again for coming on. I really appreciate it. And before I let you go, please tell the listeners where they can binge your epic and awesome show.
Well, and Alicia, thank you so much for inviting me on. I knew this was going to be a great conversation, and it actually, Andrew Jackson is one of those figures that I'm kind of dreading. I know that I'm going to have to be with him for a bit, and I'm kind of like, I'm not too eager to get there, but in this conversation, it's helped me to start thinking through some of those concepts, and actually gets me excited about approaching the Jackson presidency. So thank you so much for that. And for anybody who would like to check out the presidencies of the United States, it is available anywhere fine podcasts can be found. The website is presidenciespodcast, all one word.com. I'm available on Facebook at Presidencies, on Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Instagram at Presidencies Podcast. Again, all one word.
And I definitely suggest following Jerry on all of the socials. And he is not kidding when he says he is available. He has been a monumental assist to me as I go through this history podcasting journey. So thank you again so much for your time. And everybody go check out Presidencies of the United States podcast. Thanks, Jerry.
Thank you.
Again, my deepest thanks and gratitude to Jerry for spending his time with me. If you found his knowledge insightful, then I hope you wander on over to the Presidencies of the United States podcast and give him a listen. You will not be disappointed. You can see the links to his website in the show notes for this episode, and look for Presidencies of the United States wherever you get your podcasts. And before I sign off for the day, I want to do one more reminder about my appearance at the Intelligent Speech virtual conference next Saturday. If you haven't purchased your tickets yet, it's not too late. Be sure to secure your spot by heading over to www.intelligentspeechconference.com. Make sure to use Civics at checkout to save 10% off the ticket price. Thanks, peeps. I'll see you next week. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of Civics and Coffee. If you want to hear more small snippets from American history, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to our next cup of coffee together.